2025's Plainclothes is set in 1997 and follows Lucas, a police officer that must hide his queer identity as he engages in sting operations to catch and arrest gay cruisers. The film is told solely through Lucas's point of view, and during one of these operations, he ends up meeting someone he cannot resist. This man, named Andrew, is also closeted and unsuspecting of Lucas's status as a police officer. The duo have a genuine connection, but in the era of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, both of their career paths, Lucas as a cop and Andrew as a priest, are shaped by institutions with deeply stigmatized views of queer people. Eventually, Andrew makes his intentions to move on from Lucas clear and forces separation between them to maintain proper anonymity for each of them. Lucas gets greedy and, after learning of Andrew's occupation, sneaks a peek into the man's life as a married priest with 2 children, the last person you'd expect to be cruising. Also around this time, Lucas's father dies off screen, and there's a time jump to New Year's Eve. After an anxiety-filled night, Lucas, who had still been writing to Andrew under his dead father's name, is forced to out himself to everyone to spare his father's reputation as a family man. For a little more context, Lucas's mother had found a letter from the mysterious Andrew addressed to her husband earlier in the night, and it left her questioning his faithfulness within their marriage, as well as his sexuality. The film ends on that note, with the pressure finally being released and Lucas dropping the mask he's worn his entire life. Even after Lucas throws his homophobic uncle through a window, with the family looking on in fear and confusion, it remains an almost cathartic experience for Lucas, as dysfunctional and cruel as his family may appear to him in this final sequence. More on that later though. In this video, I want to explore the themes of the film, as well as dive deep into why I believe first-time director Carmen Emmi's creative choices are so strong and crucial to the film's overall narrative, and specifically the character of Lucas. Very briefly before I get into the rest of the video, I wanted to very quickly plug my Patreon, which I have just lowered the prices of. Originally, I had the prices at $5, $7, and $10, but I've just lowered the lowest one from $5 to $2 a month. You get pretty much all the same benefits on all 3 tiers. It's just, if you wanted to pay extra because you love me so much, you can do the other ones. $2 a month, and you'll get basically all of my videos, at least 24 to 48 hours early, save for some really big videos that I want to put out on YouTube exclusively. But pretty much all of my videos are going to be coming out on Patreon early. So if you want those perks, maybe consider joining the Patreon. No pressure though, because I know that times are tough. Anyways, let's get back into the video. Unlike a lot of other queer stories, which typically deal in unflawed and cliched characters having to miraculously power their way through the prejudices that they may face in life, inside the confines of an easy-to-digest plot structure, Plainclothes decides to take the opposite approach, forcing its central queer character to go to war with himself over the things that he has done to others like him. And I'm not claiming that internalized homophobia stories are a taboo and unexplored subject in queer cinema. In fact, I think we can all agree that they've grown a little tiresome at this point. But in Plainclothes' case, something is different in the presentation of the character of Lucas. He's not closeted and openly homophobic. Sure, he plays a major part in the arrests of plenty of gays just like him, but he never indulges in disrespecting or harassing these guys either, unlike his co-workers who seem to have no problem doing just that. In fact, Lucas can't even properly make an arrest against one of them without having a freakout. This differs from a few examples of closeted gay storylines in both film and television, which tend to kind of follow a gay man who is so repressed that he begins bullying or putting down others like him in public in order to get a leg up in hetero society. Off the top of my head, there's Karofsky from Glee, who bullied Kurt Hummel endlessly for being gay, despite being gay himself, and in a similar situation, there's Adam from Sex Education, who did some abhorrent things as well. There's also Nate Jacobs from Euphoria, who isn't confirmed to be gay, but his character arc definitely follows the same trajectory as the closet case bully. There's also Ben from Heartstopper, Sullivan from Boots, Mickey from Shameless, and if you want a lesbian example, there's Paige from PLL. And I could go on. Hey, so just an editor's note here. I realized about halfway through editing this video that I really only listed TV show characters and not necessarily characters from film. My apologies for making it sound like there were just heaps and heaps of gay films that had this specific stereotype in it. In all of these instances, the characters take the hatred out that they feel for themselves on others that are just like them. Unlike those cases, though, Lucas's conflict with others like him comes from his occupation. He is forced to participate in these sting operations as part of his job title. Lucas isn't choosing to berate or expose any gay people on his own. In fact, most of the time, he just stays in the shadows when they are exposed. He is taking part in their arrests, though, and that's what keeps him in that lovely gray area. Making a character 100% sympathetic or 100% unsympathetic is a sin within itself, so it's important to give characters layers and show that not everyone is either good or bad. And sometimes I feel like queer characters tend to go one way or another. They're either the repressed, closeted bully, or the perfect, can do no harm mama's boy. This back and forth inside Lucas regarding the role that he plays in the futures of these men adds a lot to both the narrative and his character arc, making him more complex and interesting. If Lucas wasn't a cop, this story would lose its legs. Lucas is constantly the one witnessing these men in these situations firsthand, so it's only natural that he, as a fellow closeted gay man, wonders when it's going to be his turn to be heavily scrutinized. This also leads Lucas to feel some semblance of survivor's guilt. Except unlike traditional survivor's guilt, in Lucas's case, he was the reason those men were found out. Lucas is judge, jury, and executioner in over 100 metaphorical trials, each one targeting a defining part of these men's identities. The film poses 3 major lessons for the character of Lucas to learn, and each of these corresponds to a major theme throughout the film. This is going to be a mouthful, so be prepared. There's Lucas's struggle with identity, where he learns that putting on a fake persona fosters a lot of unneeded anxiety within him, Lucas's wrong actions of punching down in a society that isn't doing him any favors, and how those actions make him feel about himself, and finally, there's Lucas's lesson regarding love. That is, in order to find love, he must wait for it to arrive. The first lesson Lucas walks away with about his identity during the film is primarily self-discovered. At the beginning of the film, Lucas is shown to have a genuine attraction to men. Lucas is at a point where he doesn't know how to confront the truth about his own identity yet. From a young age, Lucas has been controlled to behave and believe a certain way. His father, while not shown all that much throughout the film, is actually said to have been a caring and gentle man, which is quite the opposite of what you would expect from a toxic masculine father that we typically see in these repressed gay storylines. That role has been taken over by 3 different characters in the film. First, there's Lucas's grandfather, who is no longer living at the time of the film. In fact, we don't even really see him at all, but he is said to have had a huge impact on Lucas and his morals and his beliefs, as well as his occupation, as Lucas's grandfather was a police sergeant, and that obviously influenced Lucas to seek out a job in law enforcement. Through the use of context clues, we can infer that a large part of Lucas's concept of right and wrong came from his grandfather. While the film never comes out and explains this as the reason Lucas is as repressed as he is, it can be heavily inferred as such, due to the second person who helped shape Lucas's perception of masculinity and sexual identity, that being Lucas's Uncle Polly. Uncle Polly exists primarily in the flash-forward New Year's Eve party scenes and acts as that half of the film's main antagonist. Throughout each of these sequences, Polly makes things more and more uncomfortable or harder for our characters. In one of the opening scenes, our first exposure to Polly tells us exactly who he is as a person and what he believes is true about a certain type of person. Without much context for the argument, Lucas walks in on Polly's unnamed son walking out on the party before it even begins, presumably because of a fight between the son and Polly. Polly yells profanities at his son and calls him a pansy, and essentially emasculates him in front of everyone. Again, we do not know the context for this fight, but whatever it was about, clearly if Polly is resorting to insulting his own son's masculinity, he is partly at fault here. Polly continues to carry this downright homophobic tone throughout the film, helping to create a needed opposition for our queer main character. Polly's new girlfriend Jessie, who happens to be friends with Lucas's ex-girlfriend's sister, is also someone who creates conflict within this section of the film, as she accidentally almost outs Lucas, having previously heard that he was into men from Lucas's ex. Jessie whispers something to Polly that Lucas nor anyone else in the room can hear. Considering how the family was just openly discussing why Lucas and Emily broke up, this whisper exchange between Jessie and Polly sends Lucas into a panic attack. He worries that maybe Jessie outed him to his very homophobic uncle. Later on in the film, Lucas confronts his mother, who is still torn up about the death of her husband, Lucas's father, as well as the alleged affair that he had with another man. While hiding in her room, she is lectured and told what to believe about her husband by her brother, Polly, again reinforcing Polly's homophobic beliefs. Polly claims to care about Marie's feelings, but given the fact that her husband just died, he makes this whole alleged affair about himself and how wrong it was for Gus to hide his sexuality from everyone. Lucas walks in and breaks up the argument between the two, and a little bit later on, once Lucas finds out that Uncle Polly found his letter and was the one to give it to Marie, Lucas now knows that he's in the clear for the moment, as everybody thinks that it was actually Gus who was queer. However, this feeling doesn't last, as with 1 minute to midnight, Polly starts berating Gus in death, disrespecting him and claiming that if he was alive still, he would beat the shit out of him. This slander becomes too much for Lucas to handle on top of his own secret, causing him to snap at Polly, throwing him through the aforementioned window. Polly being so close to Marie and Lucas likely could have influenced Lucas's view on masculinity and sexuality and gender roles, considering how Polly treated his own son, who's not even confirmed to be queer. Of course, Lucas would be running in the opposite direction with influences like cop grandfather and homophobic uncle. It's no surprise Lucas found himself in the position that he did when you take into consideration major male figures in his life and how they influenced his beliefs. The last person who indirectly pushes Lucas to have to hide who he is throughout the film is his superior, Ron. Ron is frequently shown to be a harsh and cruel person to his trainees. In his first speaking scene, he plays drill sergeant in the training room, forcing the trainees to complete 100 mountain climbers. He describes that in their station, 1 question equals 20 mountain climbers.
We have a rule on this detail: 1 question equals 20 mountain climbers.
This is a tool used by Ron to keep the officers of lower rankings from thinking for themselves. If they question authority or the legitimacy of their superiors, they must be punished with these drills. It's exactly how the military gets their soldiers to become mindless killing machines. This blatant display of authority, as well as Ron's attitude towards gay men, tells us as an audience exactly what we need to know about Ron. This also applies to Lieutenant Sollers and new trainee Jeff, who are far less obvious in their homophobia and bigotry, but still participate. Most of the time during the sting operations, Ron is the arresting officer. Lucas might be the one undercover, but Ron almost always makes the arrest. Even when Lucas is meant to be arresting and Ron is meant to be videotaping the stalls, Ron makes the arrest for Lucas, who couldn't get the handcuffs to latch. This is clearly a personal vendetta that Ron has against queer people. He sees gay people as a threat to society, and that no doubt has had an effect on Lucas. In fact, I'd argue that Ron is equal to Uncle Polly in this regard. These 3 people have all had an influence on Lucas's perception of both masculinity and sexual attraction. These people in Lucas's life are the reason why he, 1, polices himself so hard, and 2, why he suffers crippling anxiety. By the end of the film, Lucas has learned to shed his mask. He's recently quit his job, removing all of the toxic masculinity in his life and embracing the truth, letting everyone at that New Year's Eve party know him for who he really is on the inside.
It's not Dad's letter. It's mine.
While the film definitely lacks a solid resolution in this regard, ending on a cliffhanger as everyone looks on in shock, I'd argue that the film doesn't even really need that, considering you can tell that his mother will learn to accept him for who he is, because she seemed to have no problem with homosexuality throughout the film. Lucas's relationship with his uncle might be ruined, but his relationship with his uncle was never actually that strong to begin with. Lucas really only had his uncle as an example of how to perform masculinity. There was no relationship between these two that was shown to be positive. He didn't learn any real life lessons or truths from Polly, and when that's the only thing you can learn from somebody, it's a little hard to actually foster a bond with them, especially if you yourself belong to a group of people that they have a moral objection to. All those people in Lucas's life, like his coworkers, uncle, and maybe even his grandfather, all made him feel like he was an other, albeit indirectly, since none of them actually knew the truth about Lucas, but they made him feel that way nonetheless. If you're Lucas, there's no coming back from that, unless those people take the time to learn about what they're actually scared of and make amends. One positive force in his life that I kind of haven't really mentioned at this point is his ex-girlfriend, Emily, who is 100% supportive of Lucas's queer identity, despite the fact that it ended their relationship. She's pretty much the driving force that pushes Lucas to accept who he is throughout the film, and I really love the scene between the two, where Emily tells him that he can't just shove his feelings down and pretend that they don't exist, because then he wouldn't be who he truly is.
Lucas, what you're feeling is okay. You have feelings for someone. You gotta just let yourself have those feelings.
The second lesson that Lucas learns throughout the film is also a lesson that he has to learn somewhat by himself. Unlike Emily, who helped him accept his sexuality and feelings for men, learning that his occupation is a moral failing takes a lot longer. In many instances throughout the film, Lucas sees the ghosts of Cruising's past, and in each of these scenarios, he is forced to confront the harm that he has caused all of these people. This self-reflection that he has to do throughout the film really helps drive home lesson 2. At a certain point, Lucas unpacks his own biases and his own reasons for going into a job like police work that are not completely unrelated to lesson 1, with his grandfather being a huge influence on him. During the arrest in the bathroom, Lucas can't bring himself to handcuff who he believes is Andrew, but once he realizes that that man they were arresting wasn't Andrew, he knows that this job has taken a bit of a toll on his mental health, leading to Lucas quitting his job, plainly saying, "I'm done."
No, I don't want to go on leave, sir. I'm done.
The third lesson that Lucas learns is a bit of a side plot within the film. As I watched Plainclothes for the first time, I really expected it to lean into the romance quite a bit more than it ended up doing, and really the only part in the film that's really romantic is Act 2. It's within this middle section of the film that Andrew and Lucas actually get together, and they get to talking about what their lives would actually be like if they were actually allowed to be themselves authentically. By the end of Act 2 and early Act 3, the plot has pretty much left Andrew behind, save for a confrontation scene towards the end of the film. The much older Andrew tells Lucas that
you're gonna be lonely for a few months.
But it'll pass. And you'll meet someone else and you may feel lonely again, but that feeling won't last as long.
not only does this serve as a really good lesson for Lucas to learn about entering the romantic space as a gay man and how gay dating differs from straight dating, but it also gives us a lot of insight into Andrew as a character. Andrew has had to live his queer existence through a string of hookups, never sticking with one person for too long. On the gay dating sphere, hookups are still deeply, deeply embedded in our culture, and I think the film portrays the lack of romance here very well. It's both a tragic and hopeful lesson to learn, even though these words come directly from Andrew, who is pretty much the antithesis of this lesson, having chosen to stay with his wife and children and never get serious with a guy. It's a strong message that anchors the romantic subplot within the story. Even though Lucas was falling in love with Andrew and couldn't have him, someone is out there for him. It's kind of a cliche subplot, but in my headcanon, a year or two from now, Lucas has found love in his life, and he is allowed to bring him to the next New Year's party without raising any eyebrows. Plainclothes at its core is really about the not-so-subtle way that we all police ourselves and sometimes others. Lucas's occupation throughout the film is to observe without being observed, to get close enough to these sexual encounters without actually participating in them, despite his desire to do so. When pressed about the film's exploration of surveillance, director Carmen Emmi stated,
And around that time, I read an article in the LA Times about a sting operation in Long Beach, California, where police officers were undercover and going into a bathroom and flirting with men in a park bathroom to get them to expose themselves.
Yeah.
And that was in like 2014 when that happened. And so I was just shocked that that even was going on at that time. And I suddenly didn't feel safe. And I was like, so I channeled all of that into writing. And then around that same time, my brother was becoming a police officer. And I was interviewing a lot of men who were arrested, and I was interviewing police officers, and I was interviewing lawyers who represented men who sued the city of Long Beach for entrapment. And I learned that on some of these operations, police officers would get aroused during the sting operations. And it made me think, I was like, oh my gosh, to be closeted as an officer in that situation would be so intense. And so that's how I kind of came up with the story.
And that is definitely a dynamic that Emmi has deliberately woven into Lucas's character. This internal conflict within Lucas mirrors classic theories on surveillance, such as Michael Foucault's reinterpretation of Jeremy Bentham's architectural panopticon design. For reference, a panopticon is a circular prison with a central watchtower where guards can stand high above the prison to observe many prisoners, specifically without being seen themselves. The end goal of the panopticon is for the inmates of said prison to police themselves, knowing that they will always be watched. In his book, Discipline and Punish: The Birth of the Prison, Foucault writes, Bentham's panopticon is pierced with wide windows that open onto the inner side of the ring. The peripheric building is divided into cells, each of which extends the whole width of the building. They have 2 windows, one on the inside, corresponding to the windows of the tower. The other, on the outside, allows light to cross the cell from one end to the other. All that is needed then is to place a supervisor in a central tower and to shut up in each cell a madman, a patient, a condemned man, a worker, or a schoolboy. By the effect of backlighting, one can observe from the tower standing out precisely against the light, the small captive shadows in the cells of the periphery. Foucault continues, stating, "The prisoner is seen, but he does not see. He is the object of information, never the subject in communication." The sheer size of the tower is impressive, powerful, and dominant, and helps to maintain the illusion that the prisoners are being watched at all times. Within this illusion that the inmates are under constant surveillance, the inmates are expected to police themselves. If you apply Bentham's panopticon to the real world, the same imbalance of power can be seen today in traffic cameras, heavy airport security, social media apps selling our information to the government, any smart home device like Amazon Alexa or Echo, every house on your street having a Ring doorbell camera, and of course our cell phones, laptops, and iPads, which are constantly listening to everything we say. Many of those pieces of technology are now being used to track and categorize us by ICE. More on that in a bit, though. In Plainclothes, this metaphorical panopticon is reversed. Lucas, despite being the key to surveillance state himself, also fears exposure, because he is also policing himself. This adds a lot of tension and is honestly a really interesting take on Foucault's classic panopticon reinterpretation, placing the surveying officer under a microscope as well. In this case, surveillance is a two-way street, affecting both the surveillant and the surveyed. If you want to get even more meta with it, you could argue that we as an audience are also surveying Lucas, and we are participating in this cycle. I mean, if you think about it, that's really what this film is trying to say. We watch Lucas's every single move, kind of like Lucas does to those men in those stalls. Despite Lucas's fear of being watched or discovered by those around him, he falls victim to monitoring his own speech and emotions, and yes, even his desires, constantly worrying whether or not he's performing the part correctly. This is a set of behaviors and impulses that have been conditioned into him from a very young age, as we talked about earlier. Lucas's mental state deteriorates over the course of the film due to the fact that he's never experienced an unchained existence. Since he was a child, he's had to constantly play both the prisoner and the guard on the outside of the prison. This, plus the added guilt from inflicting the same thing on others, is enough to drive him to a nervous breakdown during the New Year's party. The internal conflict plaguing Lucas is only exacerbated by the film's exploration of police moral high ground. The police department's invasive surveillance of a public restroom is justified by them under the pretense that they are putting an end to indecent exposure. And while one could argue that what these men are doing is wrong, and extremely unhygienic by the way, that is not why the police officers are targeting this men in the first place. The department's, and frankly society's, moral objections to homosexuality are what primarily drive this level of surveillance and discrimination. Really think for a second about how absurd it is for these men to follow a citizen and film them in a public restroom, hoping that they will commit a consensual sexual act with another man. Again, I don't condone public exposure whatsoever, but these men were consenting adults who probably had to keep this part of themselves locked away from society, just like Lucas. It was already socially unacceptable to be gay at the time, and it still is in many ways. This imbalance of power and of public perception sees those behind the camera shielded, while those in front of it are dehumanized and dubbed as predators, therefore justifying the department's morally gray methods of obtaining their quote-unquote evidence. In this case, who really is the best judge of truth when anything can be distorted? A meaningless conversation or an awkward look between two men in a bathroom could be mistaken as a hookup, just because it's not really socially acceptable to do any of those things in a men's bathroom. And with the right trigger-happy cop behind the camera, who's to say that that evidence even makes it to court? In the last arrest that Lucas is a part of, we can't even hear what trainee Jeff and the other man are saying on the other side of the window. No clothes have come off, no kissing has started, nothing. And yet, Ron rushes Lucas out of the closet to make the arrest. Do you see what I'm saying though? Even if we ignore the morally questionable way that these guys go about collecting this evidence and catching these guys in the act, there's still a reasonable doubt these men weren't going to hook up, like in any of those cases. Those police officers get to clearly decide what behaviors and identities are socially acceptable and which are suspicious and wrong, based on their own biases. But just think, if there wasn't such a social stigma against homosexuality in the first place, would these men feel the need to seek out cruising in general? Because if you ask me, anyone would prefer to be proud of who they are publicly than have to resort to hiding themselves and sneaking around in unclean places, meeting strangers they barely know, just to feel something for a change. Pretty much every single visual aspect of this film was chosen for a very specific reason. Choices like lighting, cinematography, framing, and even the filtering and coloring of the shots all help to inform something about the characters or how they're feeling. For example, throughout the film, there is a recurring VHS motif that visually showcases how Lucas is feeling at any given moment. This VHS filtering is used anytime Lucas is anxious or trying to read someone else's emotions. In the first instance, he stares at a man from the second level of a mall and tries to decipher if the man is gay. In this instance, the VHS signals that it is go time. I think I speak for everyone who has experienced an anxiety attack or a panic attack, or just somebody who deals with anxiety on a regular basis, that this is quite literally exactly how it feels to be out in a dangerous or somewhat uncomfortable social situation, and having to go along with that situation, no matter your personal feelings on it. The image is blurry, grainy, distressed, shaky, and unclear, which all helps to distinguish Lucas's perception of reality. I have never personally been involved in a sting operation during a cruising situation in a mall bathroom, but I personally relate to Lucas's anxiety and how it's presented here in this film. The visuals here help bridge the gap between the viewer and Lucas. I don't think I would have related to Lucas as much as I do if the visuals were not this well thought out. I'm not trying to diagnose Lucas's character through the use of a VHS filter, but I personally relate to him a lot because it really does feel like this sometimes when you have anxiety. For me personally, when I experience an adrenaline rush, it really does feel like I'm watching myself through an old VHS tape from the future about to make a mistake that I will regret. Also, there's this other thing that I didn't really know where else to talk about it, so I'm going to talk about it here. If I'm not mistaken, this only happens twice in the film. It's when Lucas hears bustling laughter from behind him, right outside of the bathroom door. Coincidentally, both times that this happens, Lucas is about to give himself over to these cruising situations. This laughter and commotion in the background, as well as the shaky VHS aesthetic, really add to both Lucas and the audience's anxiety. The implication that Lucas is being watched here right before he's about to do the thing that he is ashamed of, and the thing that could literally get him fired from his job, rings in his ear like a group of people laughing at him. In the scene after the first arrest, Lucas has the first of many panic attacks throughout the film. This episode in the bathroom starts with the VHS, or as I'll be referring to it from now on, anxiety filter bleeding through onto a normal shot before fully taking over, followed by flashes of the past that reveal Lucas has been doing this for a long time. This shifting of Lucas's reality, as well as the flooding back of memories and the anxiety filter, really sets the story into motion and creates a coherent and compelling narrative within the first 5 minutes of the film. Seeing these flashes of heavily altered grainy footage really drives home Lucas's guilt over all of these scenarios. Anxiety is a powerful and potent emotion, and I honestly haven't seen it be depicted this well on screen before. The VHS motif is visually distinct, and it adds a lot to the narrative, as well as the pacing and editing, which I'll get to talking about a bit later. The film also utilizes camera angles, blocking, and aspect ratio to their fullest, often framing Lucas and others far away from the camera to convey a sense of loneliness within the frame. Other shots that are often used on the other end of the spectrum, like extreme close-ups and slow zooms, an up-close and personal atmosphere, almost to the point of the shots feeling cramped and uncomfortable. One of the opening shots of the film zooms in on Lucas from far away, and it almost feels like we as an audience are sitting behind him in the mall, watching him through the camera on the other side. The shots themselves linger on body languages and expressions in ways that feel to us as viewers as if we're meant to be exactly like the cops the film portrays. With all of this in mind, through its visuals alone, the film subtly reveals many things about Lucas's past and the narrative as a whole, and on a meta level acknowledges us, the viewers, as the watchers as well. This is all done subtly though, and I could be reaching, but I really feel like Carmen Emmi had all of this in mind when coming up with the film's visual language. So props to him and the cinematography team for putting this together, because it's really well done. When asked about the visuals and why he chose this specific look, Emmi stated,
I used high 8, which is basically like a VHS kind of aesthetic to express Lucas's anxiety, and I feel like that alone kind of captures the spirit of Sundance in some ways.
And I will say, as a viewer with anxiety, you really do get that feeling from the other side of the screen. Throughout 95% of this film, I felt like I was Lucas experiencing all of these scenarios myself. And that is a testament to the film's visuals and how important they are to conveying emotions and how immersive they are. I have mentioned it briefly in this video, but the pacing of this story as well as the editing are both spot on. Plainclothes is a fairly unconventional story, and so therefore it makes perfect sense for the format to be different as well. In splitting the plot across 2 time periods, the film succeeds in keeping you invested in its mysteries. If the first plot, set before the events of New Year's, had fully been shown chronologically followed by the New Year's party, then it wouldn't have nearly as much suspense or half of the emotional weight that it does. And that's all thanks to the pacing and the structure. Also, the editing, scene to scene, is done really well. There is a lot of jumping back and forth, like a lot. Within the first 10 minutes, I could count at least 7 location and scene changes. That may seem like a lot for a film, and it is, but it's not unintentional here. The quick changing scenes help the viewer be as immersed in the story as humanly possible, not just to keep their attention for longer, but also so the viewer feels this push and pull that Lucas feels. The constant jarring scene changes feel like you're experiencing whiplash, which I would argue is absolutely intentional and exactly how Lucas's anxiety presents. Worrying about the future and the past as if they're physical spaces you're able to visit in the present moment, as if you could change old patterns of behavior or see how you might end up in the future, is exactly how my anxiety feels to me. The future and past are woven into the present moment, and time acts like a flat circle in Lucas's mind more than a straight line. The film feels like it's meant to be viewed this way and not linearly. Remove the jarring jump cuts to different time periods and locations, the VHS anxiety motif I talked about earlier, and the meticulous use of sound here, and the film would be your average queer coming-of-age story starring a protagonist that is slightly morally gray. All of those things I just talked about truly make you care about this man who has done some truly abhorrent things. On January 12th, 2026, NPR News, not to be confused with NPR, published an article detailing how ICE can now track entire neighborhoods through cell phones. The NPR article comes at a very crucial time for this country. For the last year or so, our neighbors have been stolen from their homes, entire businesses have had to shut down temporarily or otherwise, parents have had to literally stop sending their children to school over fear of being separated from them, and finally, many immigrants, documented or undocumented, have been shot down in the street. And that's not even to talk about the US citizens that have been shot in the street. Look no further than the illegal deportation of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, or the tragic murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. As we reach this kind of turning point in this country regarding our rights as citizens with like freedoms of speech and press and our freedom to assemble, I think it's important to keep films like Plainclothes in mind. It's important to remember that the government will never have your best interest in mind, and that even if you think you're safe because your identity hasn't been politicized before, it doesn't necessarily mean the government won't sanction violence against you. In other words, they will come for you too. Currently, entire systems of classism and racism and white supremacy are literally crumbling in front of our eyes due to the recent deaths at the hands of ICE agents. Many people who thought that the state would never target them as straight, white women or men are waking up to the fact that that's just not true. Journalists are being literally arrested for reporting. Do we see where this is headed? And it's really such a shame, because if we had listened to, as a country, if we had listened to non-white Americans, to immigrants, to disabled people, to people who the government has targeted before, we would have probably been able to avoid the severity that we're seeing today. Not to say that it would have been any better under California Kamala Harris, but I do think that due process wouldn't have been ignored, and we would have had like government issued warrants and stuff. We're not even seeing that right now. So yeah, that's depressing. While Plainclothes takes a sort of pessimistic approach to its ending, having Lucas simply remove himself from participating in the major surveillance happening around him, I think we can learn from Plainclothes and the argument that the film itself is making. And that's that surveillance is an immoral and disgusting tactic that the powers that be use to control the oppressed. I believe that someday many of us will find community again. If we can somehow do away with our phones and stop the culture wars that divide us, maybe we can come together and forge a new path. Not all in agreement, sure, but all content and comfortable. Maybe one day we'll elect officials that won't kill us in the streets, but that cannot happen unless we all recognize that everything I just brought up is textbook fascism. And the sooner we all agree that letting people be free and true to themselves, which is what these right-wing loons claim to want most anyway, is the only solution to get us there. I don't have all of the answers, obviously. In fact, I don't think you should expect this sort of commentary from me regularly, but I feel like this film is more than relevant to what we're seeing today with this 1984-esque surveillance, so I figured I'd make a video on it. And with that, I don't believe I have anything else to say on this film and the state of the world. Like I said before, I really don't think you should expect this kind of commentary from me frequently, because I'm not usually the most well-spoken person, but I think it really mattered to talk about it in this video, considering where we are as a country. I put a lot of work into this one, so I hope you guys show it some love. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!